Good afternoon from a sunny Brussels. I'm Peter Chase. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, working in our Brussels office on international economic issues. I'm delighted to welcome you today, to be able to accompany you today on this discussion about global growth, the global economy, recover or reconfigure. I think that this is a second part. It's a follow-on from the discussion we've just had with Cecilia Rouse, who is the economic policy advisor to President Biden, who talked about many of the changes, particularly that the US economy has been going through. Here, we're going to look at this question about recover, reconfigure, which suggests that there's a tension between how we address the problem of trying to versus the rather big structural changes that the digital transformation has brought to us and that we are going to need to make when we address the climate change challenge that we have. Over the last 5 days, I think the leaders of the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan have been meeting in the G7 summit, as well as the NATO summit and the US-EU summit, to try to address these things. And I think that they would say that there is no trade-off between growth today and transformation tomorrow. We have to do both. And they've made enormous pledges about the $12 trillion that they've put into the economy, the way they're going to cut to become carbon neutral by 2050, which is quite a large thing, and many other things that they've tried to do on global tax, on trade, on of course, the pandemic and transatlantic trade, and some of the trade problems that we have. I think the question, though, is that were all these fine words and all of these wonderful announcements, are they enough? Will they actually help us? Will they position us to come out of to recover? Probably. But to be able to address long-term changes? Maybe not. And I think that this is one of the issues that we need to think about and as we go forward. So we have here with us four wonderful panelists to try to help you address some of these questions. Rob Atkinson, who is the founder and the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who writes with passion, I have to say passion, on the role of technology in our society and the benefits that it has with it. Representative Suzan Delbene, a Democrat from Washington State, who brings extensive private sector experience to her work in Congress on trade and technology issues. Mariana Mazzucato, a professor of economics, innovation, and public policy at the University College London, whose most recent book is entitled Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. And Manfred Weber, a German member of the European Parliament, who is also a leader of the largest political group in the Parliament, the center-right European People's Party. I hope to give each of them a quick question, get some initial thoughts, then do some response. I want this to be as interactive as possible. I do want to include you, the people who are listening, in this as well. If you have questions, please go ahead and tweet them or put them in the panel, and my colleagues will try to make sure that I'm aware of them and I can give them to you. But in the meantime, we've got a very, very short time to try to solve all the world's economic problems. And with that, Ms. Mazzucato, I'd actually like to begin with you. You've been deeply involved in thinking, how do we actually change? Are our institutions placed, set up to address the challenges we face? Do we need to make significant changes in order to do so? And while we couldn't have expected all of the summits to solve the problems, and one question for you is, did they even set us in the right path?
So first of all, it's great we have these summits because underlying them is the recognition that we can't solve any problems alone. Any one nation state cannot solve climate change or even get ready for the next health pandemic, given the global pandemic nature of it. The problem is that unless we actually go to the structural causes of the multiple crises that we're experiencing, the health one, the climate one, the financial one, then we're just always going to be kind of too little too late, going from, basically patching up the system. Indeed, economists have actually set up a whole theory that forces us to constantly patch up the system because the justification for any sort of public policy is always at best just fixing market failures. And so, to your question, I think unless we solve the underlying problems, and what are they? The financial sector continues basically to mainly finance itself. 80% of global finance goes to finance, insurance, and real estate. The private sector continues, notwithstanding the Davos kind of moments, be wed to shareholder maximization. So $4 trillion, that's 12 zeros, have been spent by the top 500 S&P 500 companies just on buying back their own shares. So that's a lack of reinvestment into the economy just to boost stock prices and so on. And again, we have a government sector which is just patching things up constantly. So we need a fundamental new design of policy, which I think should be about creating and shaping markets to be more inclusive, more sustainable, and actually able to solve what every country has signed up to, which are these 17 sustainable development goals, and we're not getting any closer, but also to fundamentally change how the financial sector works. And that means tilting the playing field, actually rewarding long-term finance over short-term finance without changing capital gains tax and such types of structures. It's not going to happen. And, to the point of corporate governance, I think one really interesting thing with COVID-19 is that we've been experiencing something that I think is quite new that should be celebrated, which is strong conditionalities. The Minister of Finance in France said that both Renault, car manufacturer, and Air France were not, supposed to, or they couldn't access the recovery funds in France unless they agreed to reduce their carbon emissions over the next 5 years. In Denmark and Austria, the conditionality was stop using tax havens. And I know that Elizabeth Warren already with the US CARE Act was saying, any sort of recovery funds can't just be used for dividend payouts and again, share buybacks. So this idea of changing the social contract between business and the state and other actors, I think has to be at the center of any real reform. And the G7, I think, had little bits of really interesting things, including the kind of minimum on corporate income tax. But I don't think, again, small patches like that are going to change things unless we actually agree to fundamentally solve the problems we have together. And that means also backing it with a serious budget. You'll know that the 1 billion vaccines that were promised is 10 times less than what the World Health Organization is asking for. And the actual investments around climate aren't what the IPCC report says we need. But those are more just kind of the policy areas. I think coming back to my previous point, and I'll shut up now, unless we actually have also within nation states fundamental reforms to corporate governance, the financial sector, and to the remit of what public policy is for, we're just going to keep going crisis to crisis.
Thank you very much. I mean, I want to come back to that because those structural changes I think are really interesting and are worth really discussing further. Congresswoman Delbene, I think that for addressing any of these changes, we're going to need digital technologies. They are critical, for instance, in terms of integrating renewable energy into the grid and with storage. And so it's going to be something that's critical. You're very much engaged in technology policy in Congress. You've actually proposed legislation for consumer rights and data protection there. And yet at the same time, you've been critical of the European Union about some of the ways their approach to technology policy could be discriminatory against American companies. The US-EU summit, they've created a Trade and Technology Council. They're going to talk about a lot of these technology issues. They've even talked about the need for data-free flow with trust and issues like that that might get away from some of the problems with data protection that exist between us. Do you feel that this is going to be, are we going to have a problem here, or are we going to actually solve it between us? Because we'll need it solved.
I actually think we have a huge opportunity, and I am excited that we'll have the Trade and Technology Council. I think it is a critically important dialogue, and really to help set global standards, high standards. We need to come together and be rule makers, not rule takers. And so I do think that collaboration is going to be incredibly important. Actually, when you started and talked about how technology is not just its own sector, but is actually now foundational to kind of all sectors of our economy, frankly, all kind of parts of our lives, that it's really important that we don't just think of technology policy as policy focused just on technology, but we think about it more as kind of part of everything we do. And so maybe one of the core things that I think about is how do we look across many things, many types of policy, and make sure we update them to the way the world works today. That policy is very slow moving. I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone by saying that, but innovation isn't. And so we have to be forward looking as we look at policy in this space and understand that it is going to be more incumbent on us to stay up to date. In the United States, I'd say we're behind. Privacy is a good example. We had the European Court of Justice strike down the Privacy Shield, and we still don't have a domestic consumer data privacy law in the United States. So it's hard to come to the international table and talk about what we want to see as kind of a global standard if we don't have a domestic standard. And so this is an important part of the conversation, because I do think so many issues like cross-border data flows are very much part of many industries. So we need to work out and come to a resolution on these issues. But we also have a role to play here at home in terms of making sure that we're catching up with policy. And I talk about privacy a lot because I think it's very fundamental and foundational in terms of how we look at other types of policies, especially with respect to consumer rights and consumer protections. That's foundational. If we don't make progress there, it's going to be hard to make progress in other ways. Also, when we look at what's happening, for example, in broad discussions at the OECD, we had digital services taxes that definitely were discriminatory towards US companies, but we still have a problem that we haven't really updated our tax policy. It's really traditionally based on physical goods and physical presence, not really updated to deal with a digital world. So I do think it's important and part of the dialogue that needs to be addressed. And there's a lot of good work happening at the OECD right now, is how do we think about that going forward for the long term, as opposed to try to fit some new innovations and kind of the new way of working into a model that wasn't really designed to take it. And I think Mariana kind of referred to some of this in her comments too. I think that's one of the challenges for policymakers going forward, is to make sure that we're foundationally updating policy to really serve us well going forward, as opposed to adapting decades-old policy in bits and pieces to try to catch up to where we are today. And that is that's something I'm personally passionate about, but I think we have huge opportunity. And I think between the EU and the United States, we have really a shared goal there. And I think the Trade and Technology Council is a great place to start having those discussions.
Great, thank you very much. I had noticed that both of you, both Mariana and you, had talked about the need for certain structural changes and kind of systemic changes as well. But Mr. Weber, you have been a passionate promoter of transatlantic economic relations for a long time, probably understanding that, if there's $3 trillion of US foreign direct investment in Europe and $2.5 trillion of European investment in the United States, we have a totally different type of relationship where promoting our trade between us is actually promoting the global competitiveness of our companies. BMW, I think, that comes from your district, if I'm not mistaken, is the largest auto exporter in the United States, or used to be before pre-pandemic statistics. Do you think in light of that the trade, that the US-EU summit addressed the trade issues between us sufficiently well? So it's not just the structural, but sometimes also things like Boeing, Airbus, Section 232 on steel and aluminum, issues like that.
Well, I'm happy about the outcome, especially Airbus, Boeing discussions. It's a long-standing issue on the table, and now we are coming to solve it. And also in other fields, we from European side, especially on the steel, aluminium sector, we already did some steps there. The Biden administration must now also deliver that we have reciprocity in these fields. So to overcome the old mistakes of Trump and the old administration. So there is a good chance to do so. That's why I'm really happy. And you mentioned BMW as a good example. It's crazy to see that when they are exporting from US to EU, they have to pay tariffs, and when they are producing cars in Europe and bringing them to America, they also have to pay tariffs. So it makes simply no sense. Huh? And the big question ahead of us, and we all know this, the big question ahead of us is not how we can manage now our internal, probably some disputes, which we also from time to time have. I'm, as a European politician, quite experienced in solving disputes, because inside of the European Union, we have a lot of member states who have from time to time different ideas on their agenda. But again, next to these concrete issues, the real question is China, and that's why the 40% of GDP we both represent, so EU and US together, is the real figure which gives us the strength to defend our European, our life, our way of life in tomorrow's world. And that's a key question for me. That's why I'm so tough. I also want to contribute that I'm on the other hand a little bit frustrated and a little bit concerned. Why? Because when I see, for example, as European Union and the European Parliament is a deal maker in this, a place to give the approval and the consent, we have currently no majority for the Mercosur agreement, so EU South America agreement. And today, when I talk with colleagues, there is no agreement and no majority for this. I have to work a lot, even in my group, the Christian Democrats, the center right, who is a very pro business and the pro trade group in the parliament. But having CO2 in mind, having Bolsonaro in mind, there are so much discussions going on where people are a little bit reluctant and even skeptical and even against such a treaty. And we are losing, also on the European side, we are losing the momentum that trade is not something which harms you, that open trade markets is something where you benefit out of it. And that momentum is what we lost. As Europeans, we did in the last 5 years a trade deal with Japan, with our Canadian friends, for example, the CETA agreement. So we did a lot. And Trump, frankly speaking, helped us, because Mexico and others were ready to cooperate strongly with Europe because they had no partner in Washington in these times. That's why it helped us a lot. But I tell you, today we are losing again the momentum. And that's why, Suzanne, I would really be extremely happy if we can again build up this common trust that if we lower tariffs, then we don't need Asia for growth. We don't need Asia for getting a good perspective for our young generation. We have enough potential to create a good perspective for us. So don't get me wrong, I want to work together with Asia, but you know, this confident perspective to ourselves is a precondition for being then strong in the competition with China. And that's why, Peter, I'm really keen in developing a new US trade policy. And if you allow me, because you spoke about also structures, about structural questions, in having in mind that digital, climate change, there are so much really important decisions ahead of us in the next upcoming months and years. We have to find a way how we synchronize our legislative work between what is happening in the Congress and what is happening in the European Parliament. We must find a common understanding. Otherwise, our industry is getting crazy because they have different regulation on the table. So we must find a common understanding. And I hope on all sides we can work on this idea that there is such a big need to bring this together.
I agree completely with the need for greater discussion, more discussion between our legislative branches. But having worked a couple of years for a senator, I don't know whether or not you'll ever be able to have any synchronization with things that go on in Congress. But you raised a really important point, which is the question about the faith in trade, or the confidence in trade having been shaken. And it's not just trade, it's also, I think, technology. And I do definitely want to come back to this because I think that is fundamental to many of the issues that we have. But you also raised the very important point of China, which is the fourth major point that has been discussed at all of these summits, as a challenge and almost a driver, almost as much a driver in some ways as climate change for our policymakers and what they're doing on economic issues. And Rob, I'd like to actually turn to you to make a comment or two about China, because you've done a lot to write about China's technology mercantilism. And one of the questions I kind of have is that, okay, there has been a problem with the way China has acquired technology, but they've also grown tremendously good scientists who may also come up with the next answer, the next cure for cancer, the next technology to address climate change or energy, whatever the case may be. Are we in danger of cutting off that collaboration with them if we spend so much time talking about our own technological supremacy in the United States and technological sovereignty in Europe?
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter. Short answer is no. But let me just come back to, I think, a broader point that was raised about, should we change the system? Do we need to have a fundamentally different system? And a lot of that obviously came out of the 2008 financial crisis. And I would agree we need a different economic system, but pretty much very different than I think where most people are on that. I think the problem in both the US and the European system is we have not put productivity growth at the center. And nor have we frankly put competitiveness at the center. The financial crisis was caused significantly by the competitiveness crisis of the US and the reliance on Chinese dollars that propped up markets. So underlying problem in both Europe and the US is one that frankly can be mostly solved by faster economic growth, more competitiveness, faster rates of innovation. And I really worry that we've abandoned that. I mean, if you look at, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals that Mariana talked about, what I find most striking about those goals, none of them, there's 17 of them, none of them talk about faster productivity growth, which is the single most important economic driver. And when you look at the US and Europe in terms of this, US has actually been doing pretty well from 2018 until the last quarter of this year, which ended in March. Our GDP grew 2.1%, our productivity grew 6.2%. EU had a GDP loss of 5% and a productivity decline of 3.5%. So it's always striking when I hear EU conversations that are talking about all these other goals, but not productivity, when that is really at the heart of EU problems. Now let's turn to China. Why has productivity gone down? Well, one reason productivity has gone down is US companies, and to some extent European companies, they used to have to invest in productivity here. That was the way they had to keep going and cutting costs. And opening up China gave them essentially, if you will, a kind of low road out. They could just go to China, they could lower costs by wage arbitration and currency arbitration, frankly. So why does all that matter? What's the deal here? And we've done a whole series of work on this. It was funded by the Smith Richardson Foundation, looking in depth at how does Chinese, what we've termed innovation mercantilism, hurt global innovation. And Peter, your point of, well, don't some of their scientists help? Yeah, but that's not really the right question to ask. Hopefully they're going to have even more scientists, and that's great if they can do that. But when you look systematically at what China is doing in innovation, massive subsidies to destroy innovative companies. For example, if you look at Huawei versus Ericsson and Nokia, Ericsson and Nokia are significantly more innovative per budget dollar. They patent more, they have more 5G standards. They're significantly more innovative, but they're losing market share because of completely unfair trade practices and policy practices that the Chinese government has put in place. So Huawei and ZTE and Chinese policies have actually hurt innovation in the telecom equipment space. They've hurt innovation in the solar panel space. Everybody says, oh, isn't it great that China invested in solar panels? Well, they could have invested in solar panels the way we do, which is to subsidize panel consumption and let the best innovator win. They didn't do that. They subsidized their own producers. They massively reduced market share of more innovative companies. If you look at German solar panel producers in 2010, they were about an order or two magnitude more innovative than the Chinese companies. If you look at solar panel patents, they've just almost flattened out since 2010 when China took over. So confronting China is a global good. Confronting Chinese innovation mercantilism is a global good. We talked about Mr. Weber talked about the lack of support for trade, which is a transatlantic challenge. Look, the reason there's a lack of support for trade is China. If China had been playing by the rules, neither US or Europe would have suffered anywhere near the damage and the job loss than we both did. So getting China to play by the rules, which they committed to, by the way, in 2000 when they signed the WTO agreement, and they violated virtually all of it, as a new report was showing. And the last thing I'll just point out or make point on is, you know, the EU, I give the EU a lot of credit, at least in terms of talk. The EU talks a lot about climate, but actually I don't think the EU is doing as much on climate as people think. Recent study that we did, we looked at the change in energy R&D, clean energy R&D, between 2015, when Mission Innovation was launched, and end of 2018. And the US was one of 3 countries that met its innovation R&D goals for clean energy. One of 3 countries: France, Italy, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and the EU overall invested less in clean energy innovation in end of 2018 than they did in 2015. So I hear EU talking about climate, which is a global good. I frankly don't see them doing anywhere near as much. And then when you bring on China, confronting China is a global good. Getting China to play by the rules will help every country. It'll help poor countries in Africa. It'll help Europe. It'll help South America. And yet the US is really the only country that's willing to do that. And I would love to see Europe step up to the plate. Europe talks about the importance of global climate change, but we need Europe to talk about the importance of having China play by the rules, because that's so critical to having the right kind of growth and innovation going forward in the world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ron. Mariana, I wanted to actually come back to you, because you led off the discussion, and then people have come in with a whole bunch of different perspectives. And I thought that, you know, I don't know if new approaches to economic challenges has actually addressed the China one, but there have been a number of other challenges that people have mentioned in this. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on them. And then I'd actually like to, if you have any response, that's part of it, but I'd also like to come back to this question of change and how we help. We have actually a question about unemployment benefits between different countries and how that affects migration. But I'm really more interested in how are we, our governments, helping our people adapt to the change that comes about with trade, and that comes about with technology, and that will come about as we truly address something like climate change. Because I'm not entirely convinced that managing change has yet been ingrained into the way we think about our policies.
Sure, thanks. So if I can just react a bit to what was said, because I agree with a lot of the underlying points, but actually disagree quite a bit with some others. So I guess it's more interesting also for the audience if we don't just all agree. So first of all, just, you know, in terms of productivity, what's really interesting with productivity is it tends to be kind of like, I don't want to say like sex, but when you try too hard, it doesn't happen, right? Like when you focus on productivity, it actually doesn't happen. What is interesting with productivity statistics and innovation, which both myself and Atkinson have been studying for a long time, is that things like, you know, the internet, and just think of the massive, you know, effects on productivity that the internet has had, didn't come about because anyone obsessed about R&D or obsessed about technology. The internet actually solved a problem. The problem they had at the time was getting the satellites to communicate. GPS also in all our phones that makes it smart came about when the Navy had a problem to solve, knowing exactly where the ships were in the ocean. So what the SDGs are about is about reframing the problems that can also then drive investment in innovation. So it's not like the SDGs or productivity. To solve any of those 17 goals or the 169 targets beneath them, we have to invest, we have to innovate. And it's precisely when we just see them as some kind of social fluffy things on the side that then they can't get solved. So we need an innovation pathway and an investment pathway. And a lot of the work I've been doing with the European Commission recently is trying to help it kind of blab less about the challenges in the SDGs and actually use kind of a moonshot mission-oriented approach, which is to say, instead of just talking about climate change, you know, what does it mean actually to say we're going to have 100 carbon neutral cities across Europe in terms of also affecting, say, how we frame industrial strategy. So instead of just having a list of sectors, this is especially at the country level, so many countries have lists of sectors they decide are really important. Every sector is going to have to transform and innovate in order to meet our climate objectives. But if we don't actually have those objectives ingrained at the center of the economy, it doesn't happen. And by the way, a really interesting example on steel was that the German government actually put some conditions attached to the subsidy they gave the steel industry. Steel had to reduce their material content as a sector, which they did do through repurpose, reuse, and recycle, to get a euro, even just €1 from the public bank, the KfW. So again, that example of putting conditionality centered around goals at the center of that public-private partnership, that means that you don't just give handouts, subsidies, and guarantees, but you have kind of public investment conditional on the private sector becoming kind of part of the solution and not part of the problem. And also, it's not enough to spend on research and development. Just look at the US. The US spends $40 billion a year on the National Institutes of Health, which are key drivers of innovation in the drug industry. But unless you govern that process towards kind of common good objectives, there's all sorts of value extraction. I talked about share buybacks. Pfizer is one of the biggest share buybackers in the world alongside Exxon. So, what is the deal between kind of a public investment like the 40 billion that the NIH gives and what is expected back from the pharmaceutical industry, not only in terms of the prices of the drugs, which simply do not take into account that public contribution, but also the structure of the intellectual property rights. I have nothing against patents, but the way we've currently structured patents in the US and in many parts of the world has been more for kind of value extraction purposes. They're way too upstream in the innovation chain. They're way too wide, often just used for strategic reasons, and they're often very strong, meaning hard to license. So it's not about being pro or against business, pro or against patents. We need to govern production, govern innovation towards public good and common good objectives, not just out of charity, but precisely because innovation and value creation are collective endeavors. And if we just talk about R&D, productivity, innovation, without then making sure we govern it so citizens actually benefit, it leads to a lot of problems. Just coming to your question on unemployment, it's precisely, again, that point, which is, for example, we often talk about, robots, digitalization, and the effect on jobs. Well, mechanization has for 200 years been labor displacing. The first ever economics textbook written by David Ricardo in 1821, he had a chapter, don't ask me how I remember this because I don't remember anything that happened yesterday, chapter 31 called On Machinery. He talked about the effect that he was seeing at the time in the 1800s, the effect that machinery and mechanization was having on employment. What then happened for 200 years was, as long as the profits being earned by mechanization were reinvested back in the system, new jobs, new innovations appeared in other places, new skills. When that process of reinvestment stops in the 1980s, basically, because of this obsession of just maximizing shareholder value, that has a huge effect on human capital formation within companies, on R&D investments. And of course, there's many exceptions, but I'm looking at trends, and you see this on trend. So coming back to issues, again, those structural issues around corporate governance, and also kind of the framing of policy to make sure we're not just kind of filling the system with liquidity or even R&D, but governing that, I think is important. And the international trade union movement has, for example, been talking about the just transition, the need to make sure that both with the green transition, but also digitalization, it be accompanied by investments, both by government and the private sector, in people's and workers' kind of skills. But there's nothing natural about that. It has to be negotiated. So I really think the deal, the social contract, how do we negotiate a better system, as well as invest, as well as innovate, as well as think about productivity, is absolutely key. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
I can't believe that I did that. Okay, I've just been told that we're going to be ending very, very quickly. I thought for some reason I just gave us more time than we obviously have, but I'd like to continue it as much as we can. Congresswoman Delbene, on changing the construct about the way business works, it's one of the big issues that I hear about all the time over here in Europe about big tech, big American companies generally that have too much power, and the need to set limits about what they can do. There are proposals like the Digital Markets Act, or Digital Services Act. These are going to be issues that are discussed as well between the US and the EU. They've just created a new joint technology competition policy platform. I mean, is this an issue where you think that there could be a common approach between the United States and Europe, even though the biggest companies tend to be American?
Well, I actually think both the Joint Technology Dialogue as well as the Trade and Technology Council are very important, because I do think that that it's important that we work together and do all we can to come up with strong policies, that we collaborate and support innovation, and also recognize the role that technology plays in so many sectors, the opportunities that are there, also the challenges that are created. And I think we share values. We have a huge opportunity in working together and having this dialogue. I do think technology very much is horizontal, and I think that's got to be a big part of the conversation. There's a lot of focus on big tech and issues there. There's not as much focus on how we think of technology broadly in terms of the impact on the way we work, the way we do business more broadly, and how does that impact policy. I think that's going to be important, and so I hope that is also part of the conversation. I know, cybersecurity and issues there are going to be important, but really, if we look at basic issues like consumer rights or human rights, civil liberties, these are all areas that we should look at and make sure that the values that we think we have, even that we have in policy, are still consistent in this digital world. And I know, for example, in the US, we have policies that are out of date. We have a policy on email, some emails that aren't subject to a warrant standard, which really is a constitutional right. That was from a law put in place in 1986, and we still haven't updated that. I'm still working on that, but it shows you how hard it can be, and that's why I brought up this issue of getting ahead from a policy perspective. It shows how hard it can be. It wasn't intentional, the law in 1986, no one anticipated we'd be where we are today, but we still haven't updated that and made sure that our current world and our values are reflected in policy, given the way things work. And then also to the point that Mariana brought up too, we also have to think about what the long-term investments are. We have seen so many disparities highlighted through the pandemic, and one is basic access to broadband. I have in my district one of the biggest technology hubs in the globe, and then another part of my district doesn't have a broadband or even good cell service. And so when we talk about disparities and opportunities and economic impacts, the fact that student can't participate in education online during a pandemic because they live in a rural area or they can't afford connectivity, those are issues that absolutely we must address in terms of making sure that everyone has opportunity in the economy going forward. And I feel like telehealth, so many things, it's not just technology for technology's sake. And I think that's going to be a hugely important thing for all of us to focus on. So we have good long-term, durable policy to lead us going forward.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weber, we're coming close to the end, but I don't want to leave without giving you another opportunity to provide a few thoughts and reactions. I'm glad that you brought up the issue of people turning away from trade, because I think we need to have them engaged in it again. But is there anything that you'd like to add at this point?
In the transatlantic relationship, I think if we don't find a common understanding on some of the key fields where we need a new regulatory framework, then we risk a lot. What do I mean? For example, on the CO2 now, on the climate change debate, we are setting now targets. I think we as Europeans, we are ambitious. We have a 55% target as a legally binding law in Europe to achieve this for 2030. And in the next weeks, we will come up with our regulation on this. And when I listen carefully, what is the state of play on the discussion on American friends' side, then I learn that a lot of these climate change things are managed by investments, mainly subsidies for enabling things, for making things possible, to go through the way of subsidies and investments. We in Europe, we are currently discussing the way of giving CO2 a price. So making an emission trade system on European level and making this stronger. If America goes subsidy and we go price principle, then we have two worlds of competitiveness for our, especially the energy intensive companies. And that will bring us far from each other. That will divide us. That will bring the need that we Europeans install a kind of a border adjustment tax, that is currently already discussed on European level. I hate this. I hate this because I want to have open markets and not any kind of trade costs in the harbor of Hamburg or Amsterdam. I don't want to see this. Huh? But if we cannot find a common understanding how to inject now investments in climate change, in climate-friendly technologies, a common understanding which guarantees a common level playing field, then we risk to split up. And I tell you a second point on the data side. I myself, I started my political career in the Committee of Home Affairs when we discussed about NSA at the beginning of the terror debates 20 years ago, after the terrible attacks in New York. And I tell you that it is still, and it is becoming more and more difficult to keep the idea of the safe harbor thinking, let me say, the safe harbor agreement, the thinking behind, to keep this alive. We have more and more discussions in Europe where people say we have a strong privacy legislation in Europe. We have data protection rules in Europe. And Microsoft and Apple and all the big giants tell us that this is for them also perceived as a kind of a global standard, because Europe is in a way the leading continent in this. And if we cannot agree, if our American friends cannot find a common understanding about what is a regulatory framework, then we are forced to protect, to forbid, for example, the companies to transfer the data to American servers. I hate this. I don't want to see this, but that is happening if we cannot agree on a common understanding. And that's why my really appeal is, next to the classical trade things we have now in front of us when it is about tariffs and Boeing and all these things, and steel and aluminium, which is fundamental, I would say, very basic. We have to find a way to really discuss the common understanding how to regulate the big challenges ahead of us. About the challenges ahead of us, there is no problem, thanks God, about the substance, about what is ahead of us. So what do we have to regulate? There we have a common understanding. About the way to do it, there still the Atlantic is still very deep in a way. So we have to find a common understanding. That's my main appeal. And only one last point from a European point of view. We still have domestically, internally, a lot to do. My biggest fear in Europe, for example, is that we use too much of our resources, too much of our money for consumption and too less for investments into the future. That is our big problem in a societies with the demographic problems in mind, with these challenges. Europe should not lose the readiness to invest into the future with the resources we have in our hand. And on the other hand, again, we can count on the European market, on the American market together. That's my hope for the future. Together, we are still strong enough to give all the answers needed.
Well, thank you very much. I would have liked. I'm going to give you. Can you do a 30-second blurb? It'd be like a tweet, Rob.
I'll give you 240 characters. Number one, if the U.S. drug companies are so bad, why are we vastly outperforming Europe in terms of new drugs to the market? We're basically the drug innovator for the world, and that's a public good.
Second, from Europe.
The NIH.
That's Mariana, you can say that stuff, but it really, if you look at the evidence,
it's not about bad. It's not about bad.
Hold on, Mariana. You've had lots of time to talk. I don't.
That's true. That's true.
The evidence is very clear. It's not really for the NIH. So I don't want to, we can argue about that later. It's not NIH. And they're very, very clear when you look at the actual studies of where drugs come from. Secondly, US profits are lower than they were in the 60s, non-financial profits. Our unemployment rate was the lowest ever. So, there's sort of an attack on kind of the US system and productivity. And when you say that productivity doesn't happen when you focus on it, no, actually it does happen. And when you look at the scholarly evidence, focusing on productivity does get us there. And I think that really, again, I look at Europe and I see a lot of problems because you have an older population than we do. You have a massive productivity crisis. Your productivity has been lower every single year since 1995.
Rob.
And going into sort of these public goods and this UN thing, that's not going to get you the productivity you need. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That was far more than 280 characters, I'm afraid. Look, everyone, thank you all very much. We were given an impossible task to talk about something in 45 minutes when many of the individual subjects we we talked about could be easily last for more than that. But we need to quit because next the Brussels Forum is going to divide into 4 interactive sessions where the audience is actually interacting with the people in the panels much more than they could do so here. And so I just, for those people who have registered, they've gotten information, they can go ahead and click and move over to the other ones. But before you do, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for even your debates. And thank you, all of you who are attending and listening out there. Have the good Brussels Forum and a good day to all of you. Take care.